Paying with Equity, prepared for and presented at the 2014 Square One Entrepreneurship Training Program. Square One is a program of the Center for Emerging Technologies. CET is an affiliate of the Cortex Innovation Community. Square One is funded in part by the Missouri Technology Corporation.
So my topic is, now that you know the value of your company, how do you use equity in your company to pay people for services, to be your employees, or to advise you in some capacity? So I'm going to kind of go over some of the basics of the types that are out there and used frequently, and then talk about some of the pros and cons. So to get started with the pros and cons of why you would be doing this. Now, first of all, I want to point out that I stole this little blue chart off of a guy's website. I put his name down there. So I'm not saying I endorse that, but I thought it was an interesting way to look at who you should be compensating with equity. I'm not sure I totally agree with it, but at least it's a framework. So some of the reasons that it makes a lot of sense is that if you pay somebody in equity, it means you're not impacting your cash burn rate. It can be a great way to say to someone, I want you to be on my team long term and participate in our future returns of this thing. Can inspire them to be a more loyal and more productive employee for you. Some of the cons, though, are it can be complicated. We just heard Melissa talk about how difficult it is to value the company. Imagine having to value your company every single time you give away equity. So that's one of the complications of using some kind of equity to compensate people. And the other big problem for founders is that it dilutes your equity in the company. Anytime you're giving away equity to someone else, you're giving away a piece of what you initially created. There can certainly be good reasons for that, but also a downside to keep in mind. So here's some of the success stories. We all hope that if we're the one receiving those options or restricted stock or some other kind of equity arrangement that we can make out like these folks did. There's a big trend these days, especially following the collapse a few years ago, for execs to take $1 of compensation, or in Fossil's example, no cash compensation, and take all compensation in equity payments. Oh, that we could all be these folks someday. Okay, so our first category is restricted stock. So restricted stock is giving away an actual share of stock of your company just outright. You have a stock certificate and you hand it over and say, thanks for your service, here's some stock in my company. It is viewed as the simplest way. Some of the other ways to give away equity in your company is to use options, which require someone to pay a bit for the stock that they then receive in your company. So restricted stock does tend to be somewhat simpler. The taxation can be a little bit complicated. I have a paragraph in here about what 83B is. When you get there and decide to do it, feel free to give me a call and we can talk about what it really means to your company and to your employee at the time that it happens. But the basics are, you're going to value that stock, and whenever you give that to the employee, the company is going to take an expense for that compensation, and the employee is going to pick up income for that compensation, both of the same amount. And so that's where your valuation comes in. You've got to make sure you've got the right valuation there. Then you've got another shareholder. You've got to update your cap table and make sure to put them on there, because if you liquidate tomorrow, they're going to get a piece of the pie. So I've listed out some of the other characteristics, complications of it. If there is a strike price in your restricted stock where the employee or person receiving it has to pay $1 or whatever a share, the value of the compensation is going to be the difference between that strike price and the fair market value of the stock on that day. So just keep that in mind if you do have a strike price for them. So any questions on restricted stock before I move away from it? I'm going to go to options next. Oh no, I have one other before options. Anything? Okay. Okay, next up is a phantom stock or stock appreciation rights. So this is typically settled in cash, which goes back to, I guess you have to answer the question of how best you want to compensate someone. But this is kind of a middle ground that compensates someone for growth in the value of the company and doesn't give away the founder's shares or the other owner's share of that company. So essentially you either use metrics based on performance or time, like they have to stay with the company a certain amount of time, and then you pay that person a multiple or a fraction of the growth that the company experiences. So this one can get kind of complicated in the terms. You can make it really specific based on, sales reaching a specific multiple or different things like that on the performance side for them. And then you can make it be a percentage of the growth in the value of the company. So it can be pretty complex, but it does mean not giving up founder shares. So it can be a positive. So we do see this one pretty frequently, not as often as we see restricted stock or options, but it's out there for sure. Okay, next up is options. So options are a right to buy. They're a right to buy stock at a particular price. It is usually based on the day it is granted, sometimes based on the day that the stock option plan is put into place. And then as the plan moves forward and people are granted those options, they then have to vest in those options, which puts some restrictions on when they're allowed to exercise them. Then when they exercise them, they must pay a portion, or whatever the stock price agreed to is, and they would get the stock then, even though the stock is worth more, you hope. Does that make sense? I think options are pretty common these days, but that's kind of the basics of it. Okay, so I've started here with incentive stock option. Oh, yep.
Yeah, so when you were 2 slides back, you mentioned the notion of a strike price.
Yes.
In the context of restricted stock. I've only ever heard the strike price used in the context of an option.
It's not very common with restricted stock.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would just
How does it even work?
It basically winds up looking more like an option, but it has stricter restrictions on it, like restricted stock would, based on performance and other metrics.
So it's an option to buy restricted stock?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The key there, though, is that it's restricted based on their time. So the vesting requirements are typically, that's when people use the term restricted, is because of some kind of restriction set on the time before it's yours.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes I heard that lifting the restrictions of the restriction, they have some fees. So how you value the fees, restriction fees, to lift the restriction stocks?
Meaning if they lift the restriction and allow them to have the stock before they meet the requirement?
Yeah.
I have not seen that done. I would think that would mean more paperwork and documentation, and would certainly speed up the vesting period, which from a tax perspective means that compensation is going to happen earlier. So someone's got to pick up that compensation, which when you are paying in restricted stock, whenever they vest in that requirement for tax purposes, that's when you pick up the income on your income tax return. So there's no cash then if you're paying in stock. And so you've got to figure out how they're going to pay that tax and whether people are willing to do that. So I don't often see people hurrying up with restricted stock because it just means a tax outcome. I guess you would see it in context of an exit.
Yeah.
Which I was going to get to that with options too, because most of these types of plans will have a change in control clause that says if the company sells 50% or more of its total stock, that's considered a change in control of the company, and typically everything granted is immediately deemed vested. And so as part of the transaction, they would get paid out less any strike price that's there. They would be paid out that amount. Okay, so back to ISOs. So ISOs are a tax code term, and in order to be considered an incentive stock option, you must meet the requirements that are in the tax code for them, which there's like 6, and I did not put them on here, but they include that the person that they are being granted to has to meet certain requirements, can't own too much of the company, that kind of thing. It has to be based on performance in some fashion, and it has to be documented in a written incentive stock option plan. And if you can fall in all of those guidelines, then when someone is granted an incentive stock option, they do not have to pick up income on the day that they receive it. So let me go back one step to the restricted stock and talk about the taxation. So when someone, let's assume typical restricted stock where you're just handing over a share of stock in the company for someone's services. On the date that they vest in that, from a tax perspective, they will pick up income, the company will take a deduction. That moment starts their holding period for tax purposes. So you've got ordinary income as compensation on that day. If they then hold that stock for at least a year, they will have a long-term holding period, and if that stock is then sold, the capital gain on that is going to be subject to the capital gains rates, which are less than ordinary income rates. So the ordinary income rate right now is 39-ish%, there's brackets, and the capital gain rate is 20%, 15% for those under 400,000. So a big difference there and a big savings. So we want those capital gain, we want that capital gain treatment, and we want this to be treated as an investment. So that's where we get into the 83B election. Let me know if you want me to talk about that. Okay, so with an ISO, on the grant date, nothing really happens from a tax perspective. Once that person exercises that option, on that date, the difference between what they pay for the option and the value of the stock on that day is going to be their ordinary income compensation. They're going to pay at ordinary income tax rates, and that will start their holding period. If they hold it then longer than a year, they'll get long-term capital gain treatment, and yay, we have some tax savings. And hopefully a huge sale of the company, right? Okay, so if the stock option meets the narrow definition of an incentive stock option, that income on the date that they exercise is not taxable, unless they're an alternative minimum tax. But it's not taxable, and their basis in that stock is only going to be limited to the amount they pay for it, so whatever their strike price is for it. So then they've maximized the amount of long-term capital gain that they will receive, because all of that appreciation of the stock between the original strike price and all the way to the date of sale is all going to be capital gain income. So really good answer. Okay. So yeah.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind, because it's actually in the several companies I've been involved with, startups, we have done the 83B election about a third of the time. So I think it might be useful for the class if you would extend it, no matter how painful.
Yes. It just gets very technical, but I agree. We run into that question probably at least once a month, if not more. So absolutely. Okay, so with an 83B election, the employee, and the employee makes the decision, not the employer, although the impacts are felt by both. So the employee can make a deal with the IRS and say, I know that I'm getting an asset that has value today. However, I believe it's going to have value higher in the future, and so I'll make you a deal, IRS. I will pay on today's fair market value and speed up the time that I'm going to take that ordinary income. So instead of waiting until I vest in it when the stock is worth more and my compensation would be higher and my ordinary income tax would be higher, I'll pay on today's value. Which for many of our startups, we can get to a very low value based on the concepts that Melissa was talking about. We can get a really low value today. So that's the deal that you're making with the 83B. You only have 30 days from the date of grant, and that's probably the thing we see missed the most, is that people know that the election's out there, but you only have 30 days from the date of grant. It has nothing to do with the timing of your tax return. You mail in the election to the IRS to a special address, and then with your return for that same calendar year, you would also send in a copy of it so the IRS is on notice then as well. Does that make sense? Not too complicated. Okay, so non-qualified. So if you don't fit in with the definition of ISOs, or if you just don't like the concept of ISOs, where if you're going to be paying AMT anyway, people don't always find it to be useful. Then you'll have some non-qualified stock options. They effectively work the same way. The only difference is how it is taxed to the individual. And remember, the IRS has this parity between when the individual picks up income and when the company takes a tax deduction. So we're very interested in keeping those consistent. So in the case of an ISO, where the individual's not picking up compensation, the company does not get a tax deduction for that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, anything on options? I only have one other type to talk through. Yes?
Can you just speak a little bit, Linda, to the possible 409A considerations? Because I get that question all the time. And
yes.
most people are like, yeah, I heard something about this 409 thing. What do I need to do? So
yeah,
just kind of like high level.
So our basic premise when we see something that, so 409A is a deferred compensation area of the tax code. And our main goal is to avoid it because it accelerates when you have to pick up income. So if you are intending to defer the income pickup to a later year and you default some of the provisions of 409A, then you have to pick it up earlier. And there are also some penalties associated with it if you violate it and the IRS finds out later. So it gets much more complicated than that, but essentially you want to make sure that your plan has the right ingredients in it to avoid being considered just a straight deferred compensation plan where essentially you're agreeing to pay an employee down the road for services they're providing today.
And I think the key that gets entrepreneurs tripped up is if the exercise price is less than fair market value. Well,
yes.
What is fair market value? I mean, if you don't hire Melissa to do that, and entrepreneurs are just like, oh, we're just going to grant these options.
Yeah.
And you know, I think the message is pretty complicated. You shouldn't
Yes.
just be granting options on an everyday basis without really going through an analysis and having some good advisors.
Yeah.
Because that if the less than fair market value, then the company and the employees are penalized.
Yes, and you've got to be careful to keep your plan documentation up to date because we've seen a few plans that set a price way long ago and then are granting shares at that old price. Well, that's no longer your fair price for that stock. So you want to stay on top of your documentation as well. So, very good point. Okay, so my next class is for partnerships only, partnership profits interest. So the option concepts and the restricted stock concepts, they have equivalents in the partnership world, and they can cause taxation in the partnership world. But I always like to point out, if you are structured as an LLC or a partnership, look at giving profits interest because the IRS has said that a profits interest only in a partnership is not a taxable compensation event. So you can give someone an interest not in the equity of your partnership, but in future profits only, where they would get, X percent of the future profits. And when you grant that interest to them, they will not be taxed. And then in the future, they would, receive a K-1 like all your other partners and would pick up their share of income just like any other partner. So they still do receive capital gain treatment on the sale of that asset, but keep in mind as a member of the partnership, you're going to be allocated your percentage of partnership income, and a lot of partnership income for an operating company is going to be ordinary income. So they will have that pickup, but usually it winds up working out in their favor. So a good option to look at. Just keep your eyes open for that one. And you don't have to do an 83B election. You don't have to do a lot of the more complicated stuff like you would with the options and restricted stock. Okay, so then my quick hit list of if you're going to compensate with equity, this is certainly not the whole list, but these are the things that I run into the most. Make sure your cap table is updated. This is something we've been stressing with a lot of our entrepreneurs. Keeping that cap table updated and making sure it matches all of your documentation and that your documentation supports it is key. Anytime you have any kind of transaction, if you have somebody who's looking to give you money for your company, they're going to want to see your cap table. Any kind of milestone like that, you're going to want to have an updated cap table, and it's just easier to keep up with it as you go. Options should be listed on a table anytime a pool is created. And then you should have 2 columns on your table showing people's interest in your entity, one showing their current interest and one showing their fully diluted interest. That fully diluted interest assumes that all options in your pool are granted and exercised. So keep that in mind. And then once a person exercises an option, they would then move up to the main part of your cap table to show that they're an actual shareholder now. And then you would list them in your shareholder database and all that goes with that. So then my 2 caveats for keeping in touch with your tax advisor and your lawyer. Make sure that they know before you grant stuff. They can help you with making sure those 83B elections are made if you need them, making sure you and your employee understand the consequences of the compensation they're receiving. And one thing that we've run into a lot lately is folks granting compensation, especially in a C Corp environment, without actually having authorized those shares. And that's a big fat no-no, and you're gonna wind up getting dinged in your due diligence search the next time you wanna do something really cool like have a round of financing. If your documents don't support that you've had all your shareholders buy off on an option pool and you start giving away options, it's gonna look really bad. So those are my caveats. What other questions can I answer tonight? Yes?
Can you just talk a little bit more about partnership profits interest? So is that something you would advise in lieu of equity in the company for compensating first developers or first employees?
Yeah, I think it works really well. So the 2 types in a partnership are an equity interest, which is a capital interest, or a profits interest, which is only a share in future profits. And the nice thing about it is only the people that have put money into your company to pay for their share of the partnership are going to be the ones that are being allocated any losses. So Partnership 101, income and losses of the partnership are all going to be split amongst the partners and is going to be reported on their tax return each year. Each of the partners are going to receive a K-1 and report that on their tax return each year. So if the partnership is generating losses, those can offset other income for their partners. So you want the people who are putting the money in that are paying for those losses to receive those losses. But if you want to be able to compensate employees for helping that company out, since they're not putting cash in, you don't necessarily want to give them any of those losses, but you can give them a share of future profit. Most times the partnership agreement will be written to allow, so the range of allocations, to allow first all losses to go to the people who paid for those losses. Next, if the company starts earning money, you pay back the income to get everybody's capital account back to 0. And then, and only then, the net profits. So once your company reaches a cumulative 0 position, the profits after that point can be allocated to all the partners, including those that have received a profits interest. Does that make sense? Anybody else? Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about the cap table?
About what a cap table is?
Right.
Yeah. And I've got some examples. If you want to email me, I can send you our example cap table. So essentially a cap table is basically a recording of everyone who owns equity in your company. We typically make it show the different rounds of funding. So, you'll have your funders column, and then you'll have your Series A and Series B going across your spreadsheet. It will list each person who is invested in your company, person meaning an individual, a business, a venture fund, whatever. They'll all have their own line of the cap table, and it will show how much they put into the company and what percentage of the company they own. We then usually have a supplemental schedule to that makes sure that we identify which stock certificates they were granted. So if you're a C Corp, you'll have a stock certificate assigned to each grant. And also keep track of their current shareholder information like address, phone number, and taxpayer ID number. That's the basic information.